just want to provide a few basic communication tips with you today. Like I had mentioned previously, people with a hearing loss are on a spectrum and they have different preferences as to how they would like to communicate. There's no real simple answer for providing which language you should use, the best type of communication mode for these individuals. The most important thing is to just ask the individual directly how they would best be able to communicate with you. It's always beneficial to be facing the person that you're talking to. Make sure that there's no bright light directly behind you. So if you're standing in front of a window, for example, the light would come in from behind you. It would be difficult for them to see your face because of the bright light. It would be hard for them to read your lips because some people do utilize reading lips when trying to communicate. Try to minimize any background noise, especially if you're in a meeting and the door's open and you have a lot of people in the hallway walking by, creating a lot of noise that could be distracting. And it could be difficult for people who are relying on some of their residual hearing to be able to hear that conversation. So, an easy suggestion would be to close the door and minimize that type of background noise and distraction. Try to speak clearly, but you don't need to exaggerate your mouth movements when talking and do what I'm doing here. It's an over exaggeration. That's not necessary when trying to communicate. It is important to just speak normally so that they can read your lips if that's what they're doing, but not over exaggerate. Often when I tell people that I'm deaf, the first thing that they do is they start yelling at me or shouting, talking louder. Think about it this way. If there's a person who was speaking German and you don't understand German, and you tell them that you don't understand German, and then they just speak German louder, is that going to help you understand it? That's the same situation that we're dealing with. Them talking louder to us isn't really helpful because we still can't hear them. It is helpful to repeat yourself. Sometimes, like if I'm talking with somebody and I miss maybe one word or just one little concept, and I say, could you repeat that one word or phrase? Could you say that again? That is helpful. And then other times you may just need to write down one specific word that you're having difficulty conveying, or that person's having a difficult time understanding. Especially in a medical scenario, it's impossible for me to understand the nurses and the doctors when they're talking in medical terms that are often really long, really large words. And I just ask them if they wouldn't mind writing down that specific word for me. And that is helpful. Okay, next slide. This slide shows a lot of common myths about deafness. People typically assume that all deaf people can read lips and read lips really well, but actually that's not true. And I can explain why that's not true. It's because a lot of the English words look exactly the same on the lips, like beans and peas. To me, both of those English words look exactly the same on the mouth. So if they say, what kind of, food would you like, beans or peas? I can't really tell the difference. Or numbers, for example, 15 and 50 really look the same on the mouth. I can't tell a difference if I'm trying to read someone's lips, whether they're saying 15 or 50. English is one of the most difficult languages in the world. There's a lot of words that don't sound like they look like they're written on paper. So oftentimes that can be really confusing as a non-native English user. When I was learning to understand English, it was mostly just memorization on what words sounded like or what I thought they were supposed to sound like or how I was supposed to pronounce them. For example, the word read, R-E-A-D, if it's present tense, it's read with a long E. But if it's the word in past tense, it's red, sounding as if it's the color red, not with a long E. But they look exactly the same on paper. And I remember being in speech therapy and just being completely confused about how the word looks exactly the same, but is pronounced differently based on the time reference. There's another word, Arkansas, the state Arkansas. If you look at that word in print, I thought you would say it Arkansas, like it looks like it's spelled, but that's not right. That's not the right pronunciation. It's Arkansas, as if it ends with a W sound, a AW. So you can imagine how confusing this can be and how difficult it can be for people who are unable to hear the auditory language and how it differs from how it's written in print form. So it takes many, many years of speech therapy. But anyway, back to the lip reading. That's why it's so difficult. And that's why most deaf individuals are more comfortable using American Sign Language, a visual language, just like for Spanish speaking individuals that's their first language. They're more comfortable speaking in Spanish. It's the same for deaf individuals. English as a second language is more difficult to use, and it's easier to use our first language, which is American Sign Language. Okay, on to the second bullet point here. If an interpreter is not available, it is helpful to use notes and just write back and forth on a piece of paper. That is a way to communicate. But I will say it is difficult now to find American Sign Language interpreters all over the US. There is a shortage of interpreters, and this is a nationwide issue. And it's an issue for deaf individuals to have access because there's not as many interpreters available for their appointments. Previously, there were more children in mainstream settings in the K through 12 setting. Then they went on to the university level and then on to a profession. Many deaf people have careers where they utilize American Sign Language interpreters, and we saw that. But now there's just less interpreters available, and that does impact the community, and less CART providers also. So we definitely need more people in those fields. Okay, there's another myth, and that is all deaf and individuals have deaf children, and that is not the case. 95% of people who can hear, we call those people hearing, they're the ones who have deaf children. So 95% of deaf children have parents who can hear. There's another misconception too, and it's that they can't hear so they can tolerate loud noises well. And that is a myth. Like I said, some individuals do have some residual hearing left that they can use, and they can hear some sounds depending on the decibel, and it can sometimes be too loud for them to tolerate and be uncomfortable. Okay, next slide. Okay, go ahead, David.
It'll help if I unmuted the microphone. This is David Payne. So I want to talk quickly about some different assistive technologies that are used. We could give a 3-hour presentation on just assistive technology options. So I'm just going to try to give you a few brief groupings of some different assistive technology. So deaf and hard of hearing people may be using hearing aids or cochlear implants. What's important to know is just because you see someone with a hearing aid or cochlear implant does not mean that they can magically hear you. It doesn't work like glasses, right? If you have vision loss, very often you can get glasses and now you can see 20/20, right? And so it fixes your vision loss while you're wearing those glasses. Hearing aids and cochlear implants do not work that way. Hearing aids are generally just making all the sound louder to try to get it into a range that a person with some hearing loss can hear. And it gets much more technical and sophisticated beyond that, but that's the general idea. Cochlear implants are using an artificial means of stimulating the auditory nerve inside the cochlea. So that is inherently an unnatural experience and requires a great deal of training to use it correctly and to understand the input coming from those devices. So some people that with a hearing aid, a cochlear implant, you might not be able to tell they have hearing loss at all. And then others, despite having those technologies, will have no understanding of what you're trying to communicate to them. So do keep in mind, hearing aid does not equal now they can hear you. But it may be something they do need to communicate more effectively. The second picture in the middle, that's got the headphones and the little box with a microphone on it, is called an assistive listening device or personal amplifier. This is something that someone that has some level of hearing loss can use to get rid of background noise. These can be really effective in one-on-one settings, like at a reception desk, or in a one-on-one consultation with a provider or like a service provider, a social worker, a doctor, because it helps to block some background noise and amplifies only the voice of the person speaking who's holding that microphone. Again, the effectiveness of that depends on the technology, how you're using it, and whatever hearing capacity that person has. So this is not going to fix every communication you need to have with someone, but it is a great tool to have available, especially if you're working with members of the public who anyone could come up to you and be experiencing some kind of hearing loss. Or sometimes they function normally otherwise, but when they walk into your crowded waiting room, they can't hear anything over the TV in the background, the people talking. So that's a good option. The little card on the other corner, that's big red card that has a red stop sign and says, "I'm deaf or hard of hearing." This is something that our division can provide to people with hearing loss so that they can keep this in their car. And if they have any interactions with law enforcement, they can show this to them to let them know, "I have hearing loss. Here's how I need you to communicate with me." On the bottom left corner, you see an example of someone using a video phone. It's a fairly old video phone. It's an old picture, but the concept is still the same, that a person using sign language can make a phone call that connects to a video interpreter. So like you see the interpreters we have on screen, I would see the interpreter, I would be using American Sign Language, they would have a headset, and they would be speaking to someone on the other end of that phone call that is using English. And then there's always writing back and forth. That is an option that you can use. Dianne mentioned sometimes it can be as limited as writing down 1 or 2 important words, or it can be a back and forth conversation. What I would caution you is to never assume the English literacy of someone. Don't assume that just because you can write back and forth, now you don't need to deal with interpreters, you don't need to do anything else, everything's fine. You want to make sure that you keep those written interactions short and simple, because again, you don't know the literacy level of the person on the other side of that pen. For anything that's sensitive, very important, you definitely want to avoid just writing back and forth or just handing someone a written document and expecting them to read that and understand. The great way to use that pen and paper is to dialogue with someone about how they would like you to communicate with them. All right, and I will move on to the next slide. We're talking about planning ahead for access. I think most of you are ahead of the curve. If you're part of the groups that are here, you've already been working on doing this. If you don't plan ahead, then you will end up wasting time and wasting resources. Part of that means doing what you're doing, maybe making language access plans, making sure you have budgeted time and money to provide the access that people need. If you try to add access later, it will always be more problematic, more expensive, cause more headaches for everyone than if you plan for it from the beginning. The next thing to consider is that where it's appropriate, provide the access without being asked for it. I'll put a little asterisk next to where appropriate, because what a lot of people do who are well-meaning and very excited to try to provide access, they will, for example, say, great, every meeting we're going to have from now on, we're going to have a captioner, we're going to hire ASL interpreters, we're going to hire a Spanish interpreter, and it's going to be beautiful and great, and everyone has access. The problem is there may be no one there that needs that access. Dianne mentioned earlier, there is a shortage of American Sign Language interpreters. I know there are shortages of a lot of spoken language interpreters as well. So a well-meaning person who wants to provide access starts providing interpreters for all sorts of things where no one needs that. And now you've pulled those interpreters out of the community and other places where they are needed. A lot of times this is people's response to the idea that this way I don't have to plan ahead. I just always have it. But that actually can result in some unintentional harm to the communities that you're purporting to be providing access for. So my best recommendation is if you're planning something, plan further ahead and make sure you advertise in a way that it gives people the opportunity to request what they need. And then it gives you enough time to plan for providing what they've requested. Now, if you're going to host a public forum and you know you're going to have several hundred people there, well, I can pretty much guarantee at least one of those people will have some level of hearing loss. So maybe for that public forum, it's a good idea to explore adding captioning. That will benefit someone there. You may not have any deaf people that are going to come to that forum. Did you advertise in spaces where deaf people are going to see that advertisement? Most deaf people, to be quite honest, will see that and go, well, it doesn't say anything about accommodations. It doesn't say anything about ASL interpreters. So it's a waste of my time. But if you advertise and you clearly state ASL interpreters will be provided on request, or if you already have interpreters booked to say ASL interpretation will be provided, that communicates to the community, they're welcome. That's taken care of. The same for Spanish, right? If your flyer is also in Spanish, that tells people who speak Spanish, hey, I'm probably going to be taken care of. That this is going to be accessible for me. If that's the case, make sure it actually is accessible. Sometimes we've seen situations where people say they'll be interpreting, and then when no one asks about it, they just, oh, well, let's just cancel the interpreter. But you've now advertised you'll have an interpreter. So anything you commit to do, follow through with it. But the best way to do that is to give yourself plenty of time. You also have to budget money, time, and staff capacity for arranging these access needs. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide to talk a little bit about considerations in trilingual environments. Now, I'm primarily addressing situations where you have the need for a spoken language interpreter and an American Sign Language interpreter. But this could apply to situations where you need multiple spoken language interpreters. So the first question you need to ask is, how many interpreters will I need for this? My strong recommendation is that you not ask any one interpreter to interpret in more than 2 languages, no matter how many languages they are fluent in. So I speak Spanish, English, and I'm an ASL interpreter. But when I have interpreted in those contexts, I tell people pick 2. Because trying to interpret 3 languages at the same time is not effective. People think it's a great cost-saving measure. Oh, you speak Spanish, and we have a deaf person and a Spanish-speaking person, so we're just going to hire you to interpret for everybody, but I speak English, by the way. It doesn't work. So consider how many interpreters you need to accommodate the languages present. That may mean you need more than 1 interpreter for each of those languages. If you have a 2-hour meeting, you may need 2 American Sign Language to English interpreters and 2 Spanish to English interpreters. If you have a small 15-minute, 30-minute meeting, you may only need 1 interpreter for each language. But if that 30-minute meeting is helping to determine the placement of someone's child in whether they're going to be placed in foster care or returned to parents, you probably want to have teams of 2 interpreters for both of those languages, because that is a very high impact situation, and you want to make sure that the interpretations are effective. So you have to consider a lot of factors when determining how many interpreters you need. The second thing is, I would caution you against the use of bilingual staff as interpreters. As I mentioned earlier, interpreters need to be trained to interpret well. A lot of people working as interpreters don't have a lot of interpreter training, either because it's not accessible, it may not have been available in the language that they're interpreting in, or they may just not realize that they really need training. So using bilingual staff to serve as an interpreter could put those individuals they're interpreting for at risk, could put your organization at risk, and the staff member who is serving as an interpreter at risk. If they aren't trained and they're acting in the role of an interpreter, they could make mistakes that they would not be aware of how to correct those. They may not be aware of the appropriate role of themselves as an interpreter. So if they're a staff member, they may be thinking more about, what does this organization need, and not considering what those other individuals that are interacting with your organization need. Right? They're going to have some level of bias because they are a staff member. The same applies to using friends and family members as interpreters. I generally recommend not doing that when you don't, unless there's a very particular situation where you have no alternative. A lot of people just assume there's no alternative, or assume, oh, this is easier. I'll use their 16-year-old to interpret for us, or their adult child came with them. I'll use them to interpret. The problem is that those family members inherently have a conflict of interest. If they're a family member or friend, they have a vested interest in the success of the person they're there to interpret for that may be at odds with what you're trying to do. One example that I run into with this is the DMV. I have gone to interpret. I'm a professional interpreter, and I have a vested interest in this person only passing their driver's test if they know how to drive, right? That's what I want. And as a neutral interpreter, I know that's what the DMV wants. You need to prove that you know what you're doing. You need to prove that you understand the rules of driving. But if I was their friend and I wanted them to just pass the test, I could be giving them additional information. I could be giving them answers. Well, the DMV sees that happen. And so now when I go in as a professional interpreter, they're suspicious of everything I do. They don't trust that I'm there to interpret, because they've seen situations where people are using a friend or family member, and they've found out at some point that they're not interpreting accurately. Or maybe even if they are, they have no way to verify that, and they don't trust. So when at all possible, avoid the use of bilingual staff as interpreters, and avoid the use of friends and family. Bilingual staff as direct service providers is a different situation. If you have a staff member you know is fluent in Spanish, you have Spanish-speaking individual present, if that staff member is providing the same service they would be providing in English, but providing it in another language directly, that's why you hired a bilingual staff member, right? That is not interpreting. Interpreting is when that person is serving as the conduit for interactions between other people in multiple languages. So avoiding dual roles, I talked about that. You don't want to be a staff member and an interpreter, or a family member and an interpreter, or an advocate and an interpreter, because those roles will always put you in some sort of conflict, and that could result in harm to someone. Also, in trilingual environments, expect it to take a lot longer. So if a deaf person is signing, I'm rendering a message in English. Now a Spanish interpreter gets the English message that I've just interpreted, and they're interpreting it into Spanish for someone else. There's an extra step involved, but it also may mean that people need to take more pauses, because I may need to clarify something with the person that signing, the deaf person. The Spanish interpreter may need to clarify something with me, and then they render an interpretation, and that person might ask a clarifying question that has to go all the way back over to the deaf person. So expect those interactions to take a lot longer. And the last thing is, a lot of people like to use telelanguage services over the phone or video remote interpreting. And those things can be effective and wonderful in certain contexts, and they can be horrific and put people in danger in others. So I would say just be judicious with how you're using those telelanguage and video remote interpreting services, because they may not be effective. And if any party to that interpretation is telling you they're not effective, please take their word for it and find another option, even if that means rescheduling. So I'll step off my soapbox for that last one, and we will move into a few, well, actually, I think we're going to move over to having Kayla speak a little bit, and then we'll talk about a couple scenarios before we have questions.